Hi, my name's Dan, and this video is one in a series of videos that I'm doing about resources and designing resource management stuff for video games, which is part of a larger suite of videos on game design in general. And in this one, I'm wanting to drill down a bit on some of the details uh, um, of resources. I'm still being quite vague about what resources, but tending to lean towards currencies and things like that, but there are all sorts of resources that you might have in games. And I particularly want to talk about sources and sinks. So sources are obviously where the resource comes from, and sinks are where the resource goes to. And I'm thinking about this from the player's perspective, really. Okay, so let's have a look at some sources first, and imagining maybe the resource we're talking about is money. You might start with some at the start of the game. In fact, whatever resource is, you might be given this at the start of the game. There might be a regular drip feed of the resource that happens. So regenerating resources like health and mana can effectively be as the result of this. But if you've got some kind of management game, you might have a regular drip feed of some income that comes in from player actions, and this is probably the most likely place where they're going to happen, and from transactions. So actions and transactions, they kind of overlap quite a lot. There's a bit of a nuance there uh, um, in the wording. Actions would be something like going and mining a coal face and producing coal as a result from that. And a transaction would be taking some of your money resource to a vendor and buying coal resource. So you're swapping one resource for another. There may be randomness involved. There may be random stuff that happens, and it might be random in terms of if you get the resource, and it might be random in terms of what you get in terms of the resource. So, an example for this would be drops from enemies. Very often there's some kind of randomization in there, and it may just be randomized. You get a certain amount of money, but it's within a few boundaries. But it may be that you also get items that are particular resources. Another way of talking about some randomized resources is that any kind of game that's a card game that relies on where you're thinking of the cards as resources. The cards that turn up are randomized. What you might know, you're definitely going to get a card at the beginning of a turn, but you don't know what that card's going to be. Okay, so the other side of the equation is sinks. So it's what ways does the player lose the resource or a number of the resource? And so there might be a regular outflow, like you've got a regular income, and there may be a need for some kind of regular outflow. So if you've got a game with an avatar that you're playing, and the avatar has such a concept uh, hunger, then you're going to need to keep feeding them. So that's a resource that you keep pushing into the character just to keep the game going. And the Sims games rely on that quite a lot. There's resources in and resources out, and you've got regular things that you have to pay for. Or you might have, if you've got some kind of, I don't know, transporty tycoon type game, you might have an upkeep cost every month. You might have to pay upkeep for your infrastructure. You might choose what to buy. So you can choose what your transaction is, and you can choose when you have a transaction. So transactions are the other end, as so they're both sources and sinks, obviously. And there may be resources that you don't so much use to buy things with, but you use. So in my head, the picture goes a bit like this, that we talked about actions and transactions for gaining resources, which is where you can do something as a player to gain a resource, or you can transform one resource into another. When you transform one resource into another, that acts as both a source and a sink, but one for one resource and one for the other. And the equivalent to a player action to gain a resource is a player using something. So it's a player action to use up a resource. So you could, your choice in that is to choose when to use it and potentially where, depending on what the kind of resources are, or maybe on what target. So if it's offensive and it does damage, so it's like a hand grenade or something, you can choose where and when to use that to give you a tactical choice inside combat. Um, so I'm going to talk about different types of transactions or different types of things that can happen in terms of exchange of resources. Um, that's just a picture from Civilization 6 of a transaction. So the simplest kind of transaction is some kind of exchange. So, for example, when you buy a health potion, or when you craft a pickaxe in Minecraft, or when you drink a health potion, so you're turning the health potion into health. You can invest. And so, for example, this might be buying a business. And some of the Grand Theft Auto series of games allowed you to buy businesses, which would then give you a trickle feed of money coming back in. So you spend money to get this uh, uh, to get this investment, and then the investment pays off slowly over a period of time. Although in the Grand Theft Auto games, if my memory is correct, uh, generally speaking, you'll get to the end of the game before they'll actually have paid for themselves, depending on how quickly or slowly you play. Um, Other kinds of investments could be ones that also transform the resource. So, for example, buying a cow. Maybe you've got a farming kind of game, so you spend money to buy a cow, and then the cow gives you, I was going to say a trickle feed, but that's slightly too literal. But you get on a regular basis, you can milk the cow, so you get a source of resource by investing it. Or another kind of investment is kind of investing in your player or your gear so that you can be more powerful, investing in a better sword, or upgrading your car so that you can win more races or win faster races. So that's a kind of indirect investment in that you're spending it for some kind of uh, game purpose, but then the game purpose will uh, give you rewards later on. You can gamble. There's again various forms of having gambles involved in games. There's obviously the very straightforward idea of a gamble, a roulette wheel, or some kind of literal gambling mechanic. But it could be something like a race entry fee. So if you've got a racing game, then it might cost you money to enter the race, and then at the end of the race, if you've won, you get a return on the investment. And if you haven't won, well, it might be if you get second or third that you get something. But if you're coming in lower down in the pack, maybe you've lost your entrance fee. One of my favourite games in terms of this sort of things is there's an online pool game where you have an in-game currency and you pay to uh, play against another. It's multiplayer. You play against some random person in the world, and you both put up an ante, and then the person who wins gets both antes out. So that's another way of gambling, but actually it's gambling on your own skill. Um, and then I guess another sort of gamble is a risky investment, or something like buying a loot box. I'm going to move on very quickly from that. Um, Other things you can do in terms of um, sinks for resources, potentially paying for services, so things like fast travel and training, etc. So what you want overall is, well, I'm going to spend a bit more time talking about design thoughts for resources in the next video, but very quickly I want to say that um, I guess the whole point of these sorts of mechanics in games is that it gives the player options and tactics. It gives them choice. It gives them the ability to progress in the game, but also to use their brain in the process. So that all makes for, hopefully some kind of good player experience if you get it right. However, resources need to be balanced, and as a designer, you need to be thinking about how the flow of the resource works, particularly um, currency type resources like money. You may not have to think in too much detail about the exact nature of transactions for health potions, but these things are kind of worth thinking about potentially, depending on the nature of the game as well. Anyway, as I said, I am going to go into more detail in the next video into some design thoughts for resources. So that's it from me for now.